if someone is, they are trying to replicate everything that you just described about the ideal, the platonic ideal perhaps, of what a university ought to be. They're trying to replicate the intellectual value of going to university, pursuing a bachelor's, or perhaps beyond, but they're not doing it inside of the confines of a university, whether it's because they didn't want to go all together because they have financial concerns or ideological concerns or practical concerns or whatever about the university system. Or maybe they did go to college like we talked about earlier and they didn't feel like they quite got it. And they're trying to recreate this. They know they want to be a lifelong learner, but they're trying to figure out how. Is it possible to sum up what the core elements ought to be that one is making sure, like, is there a set of actions or a set of principles or a set of, I hesitate to reduce it down to a checklist, but I presume that there are elements that can be quantified. It's like you want to be reading, you want to be getting, contradictory opinions, you want to be discussing, like, and maybe if it's easier, we can put this directly on me. Like if I am, conceited enough to give myself the self-proclaimed responsibility of, I want to be intellectually pursuing things around education in a public-facing way, which means there's some level of responsibility besides just making sure I'm not, sending myself down weird rabbit holes. But like, I want to be a steward of information in a way that's helpful to other people. What are the things I need to make sure I'm doing? I don't know if it's easier to talk about it in the abstract or the specific. Both are fair game. Yeah. But to the level that it can be quantified, is there a simplification of the general way that people should be thinking about doing this to kind of have a benchmark for whether or not they're doing it well or if they're missing something that's like a critical ingredient?
I mean, if what you're asking me is, how do you kind of create or box a university equivalent experience outside of a university or something like that.
Kind of.
Yeah.
We can take it if that's easy. We can take it there if you want.
I guess I'm saying the problem that I have in answering that is I don't even think universities know what you need to be doing at universities. And so it's hard to transfer that. So it's hard to say.
You're jumping to my next question. Yeah. This is fantastic.
So I mean, look, I think universities have just become cultures of habit. And, these things called majors just sort of exist there because they've existed for a very long time and people get PhDs in them and then want jobs and teach. I mean, so to me, most universities don't have any sense whatsoever of what they're trying to achieve holistically with their students. And they're actually much worse off than K through 12 education. At least K through 12 has a kind of set, a defined, maybe sometimes nebulous sense of like what young people need to learn and achieve to kind of move on. Universities don't have that. They have lots of checklists. But I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, the utter futility of having something called general education requirements, right? So the idea is like, well, you're at a university, some kind of broad knowledge is important. So we're going to create 12 different categories and you need a class in each of those categories. But it doesn't really matter which class you take as long as it technically meets the category. So you just assembled 12 classes and most of students are taking classes not because they're intellectually drawn to them, but because they don't want to get up before 9 o'clock in the morning and this is what's available or that. So you have this kind of technical requirement that doesn't really add up to any kind of intellectual compound. This is the kind of habitual ineptitude of higher education. They exist. These are products of bureaucracies that come from a system of credentialing that, and that, it's sort of all downstream from a kind of commodification of education. And so again, I'm talking myself out of a job, but this is just true, right? And it doesn't mean if you're at a university, you can't find wonderful professors or have great conversations with peers and discover things or read things or that. But I do think the way universities are set up today, that is more the exception than the rule in most cases. And so when you ask me like, what do I need to do to have the equivalent of a university
Like
education?
maybe don't.
I'm like, let's just kind of shunt to the side the idea of what a university education is, and approach it from, what do we need to do to be intellectually responsible human beings?
Mhm.
That's a different question, and 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 so maybe I would answer it. This is going to be a radically unconventional answer.
This
Okay.
is
All
a
right.
home for those.
Okay. All right. We're gonna go back to Plato.
Okay.
All right. And I think it's in the Theaetetus. Plato talks about the human soul. He uses, for the image of a human soul, he uses a flying chariot. So there's a chariot flying through the sky, and it's being pulled by two horses, a black horse and a white horse, and there's a charioteer driving the chariot. And it's, sort of making its arc across the sky. And in Plato's formulation, the charioteer is human reason, or rational capacity that's trying to keep its hands on the rein and move things in one direction and keep everything going. The white horse is always trying to pull the chariot heavenward, and it represents what Plato calls thumos, but what we think of as our kind of spiritedness, our drive, our need to be great and to be victorious and to achieve things, and this kind of spiritedness is a great way to put it, and that's trying to drag us up to the sun. And then the black horse represents our kind of appetites, those things that our physical desire, physical nature, things that bring us to earth. And it's always trying to pull us down to earth. Okay. To allow either of those things dominance, is going to pull the chariot either crashing into earth or up into the sun. And so the job of reason is to try and find a way to maintain control over both our thumos and our appetitive nature. I think that's what the point of education is, right? To align our reason with, to come to understand who we are in a thumotic way, like who we are in a kind of rising spiritual way, and who we are as an embodied creature, and then to be able to continue through life's journey in as steady a state as possible, but you're still always going forward. So to me, the things you need to do that, that's what you need to do to be educated.
My friend Taylor Foreman, who's done a bunch of writing for Rebel Educator, and I, we've talked very extensively about, we use a different set of metaphors, but the general idea that you just described, we talk a lot about feet in the dirt, head in the stars, as the correct alignment of, at the end of the day, all of the work that we're doing, we're also grappling with this question of what ought an education be, and how do we simplify and summarize that in a way that a parent who doesn't necessarily feel terribly qualified to educate their kid, they have no background in education, they don't know if they can pull this thing off. They're going to try because it seems like it has potential to be a much lesser evil than, and even an overwhelming good compared to the potentially outright evil that is the system that the child is currently being subjected to. But they don't necessarily know what it is that they're doing. Yeah. And so, a huge part of how I see my job is taking these conversations and this work of all of these amazing people who've thought and researched extensively about what education ought to be, and simplify the sort of core tenets of it. Like here's how to think about the ideals of it, and that feet in the dirt, head in the stars, I think is really important. So I love that that's where you brought this back to.
Yeah, I mean, I apologize if I've been completely unhelpful to parents who are looking for sort of practical things. And so let me try to align it with something maybe a little more practical.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of it simply as, the job of education is to sustain the human soul. And the human soul has three components: the sort of intellectual, rational, the physical, material, and the spiritual. So education should feed all of those components, right? So that there are things that feed our intellect, things that inspire us, that things of beauty, things of creation, that, and then things that help us to strengthen ourselves, physically. And some of that is actually physical. Like, kids should exercise, but also kids should come to know who they are and what the consequences of being an embodied being are. Being an embodied being means we have bodies that want things that pull us in moral directions. How do we have a moral matrix? That's the kind of steering of things. It's not just make sure you have a healthy diet and, go to the treadmill. It's like, as an embodied being, how do I live in the world in a way that's morally responsible? Our bodies are kind of untamed creatures that need
It's funny how
some direction.
it takes you down the rabbit hole really quickly. It's like you're hungry, but you don't just steal food from over there. Why? Like you get into the depths of morality very quickly.
Right. And that's why all these things are interconnected, right? If any three of those components falters, the chariot crashes. So getting everything aligned, I think, is important. So if you're a parent and thinking about educating a child, I can't give you a checklist of like, this is the math you should be doing, and these are the, the books you should be reading. What I say, like, how are you feeding the mind? How are you helping a student understand what it means to be an embodied creature? And how are you stimulating the spirit? That would be my assessment tool. All right. Those 3 boxes.
I think that's fantastic.